The title of today is Gaza Revisioning David and Goliath 2020, and we are going to be hearing from two different people who have a direct experience of Gaza and Palestine. And the first of those that we'll hear from is Chris Bargout, who is one sec. Sorry guys, I just realized I'm supposed to spotlight my video. We're figuring this out still. There we go. But first we're going to hear from Chris Bargout, who is Palestinian. His father is from Palestine. Actually, fascinatingly enough, his father's from Palestine. His mother is Anabaptist, ethnically Anabaptist from Switzerland. So he has a really unique combination of both Anabaptist heritage and Palestinian heritage. We will also hear from Ned Roche, who recently came back from a trip to Gaza where he was doing, you're gonna have to correct me later, Ned, if this is wrong, but trauma-informed yoga practice. And he has some amazing stories to tell about his time there. And we're so glad that he's able to join us. He is from here in Portland and has been a part of Jewish Voices for Peace for a long time. So we're glad you're all here. One housekeeping thing is that if you want to ask questions, we're still figuring it out, but you can either use the chat, which is down at the bottom. You can press chat and type in questions because we'll have a Q&A at the end. Or you can, I think, use the Q&A button. And hopefully I'll see both of those. I've also heard something about raising your hand. I don't 100% understand what that means, but if I'm able to figure it out, we'll do it. So if you'd like that, and that's for an audio option. So you can virtually raise your hand during our question and answer time, and we'll try to get to you as well. So I will open us in prayer, and then we have a short video to watch about what's happening in Gaza. Let's pray. Lord, you are Lord of heaven and earth, and we thank you for the opportunity to learn about what is happening in Palestine and in Israel and some of the factors at play. Would you open our eyes? Would you open our ears? Would you open our hearts? And may we gain knowledge today that we might better be instruments of your justice, love, and peace. Amen. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. And we are going to...
What would happen if you built a refuge for persecuted people in a place where another people already lived? In the next few minutes, you'll learn why this moral quandary is at the root of the struggle between Israelis and Palestinians, and what you can do to help achieve a just peace for everyone in the region. First, there are a couple of things it's helpful to understand. One, many Jews fled harsh persecution in anti-Semitic Europe, especially the Nazi Holocaust. Zionists encouraged massive immigration to historic Palestine, at that time a British colony, where Jews had an age-old connection and where small Jewish communities had long existed among larger groups of indigenous peoples. But when the UN offered the Jewish immigrants the majority of the land for a new state called Israel, for the indigenous Palestinians who lived there, it was a massive destruction of life. They rejected the UN's partition plan, and several Arab states invaded the new state of Israel. Israeli forces essentially erased over 400 Palestinian villages and towns. By the end of the fighting, Israel controlled 78% of historic Palestine. And when 750,000 Palestinians who fled or were expelled during fighting tried to return to their homes where the new state now stood, they were permanently barred by the Israeli government. Well over 100,000 of their relatives and neighbors who hadn't left became second-class citizens of the new state, along with the new Jewish majority. Today, Palestinian refugees and their descendants number in the millions. Most are in the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and Jordan. Many are spread throughout the world, with millions still living in refugee camps, seeking to return to their homeland. To sum up, one group of refugees found a much-needed home, but in the process, a new group of refugees was created. Here's the second thing to understand. Israel was founded as a Jewish state. But now ask yourself, what exactly does that mean? People had lots of ideas about what a Jewish state should look like. Some called for equality for all citizens. But what was created in practice was institutional discrimination against non-Jews. In other words, Israel ended up being built on a blueprint of exclusion. The Israeli government wants maximum land and resources for Jews, but not the Palestinians living there. That's why inside Israel, Jews get special privileges, including rights to land and housing, that are denied to the Palestinian citizens, who make up 20% of Israel's population. That's also part of why Israel has never defined its borders. In fact, they still hold on to land, the West Bank and Gaza, that they conquered in the war in 1967. Since then, Israel has built Jewish settlements throughout the occupied West Bank, building Jewish-only cities and supplying them with infrastructure like roads and army camps, schools, and even a college. Military occupations are meant to be temporary, but after 40 plus years, this one looks permanent and entirely unjust. In the West Bank, Israeli Jewish settlers and Palestinians live on the same land, but must live under two completely separate and unequal systems of Israeli law. The Jewish settlers dominate the natural resources, including water and agricultural land, and they're backed by the Israeli army. To maintain the occupation, Israel has demolished thousands of Palestinian homes and orchards, confiscated Palestinian land, bombed a captive civilian population in Gaza, and punished resistance with raids, arrests, and assassinations, all to gain maximum land while making life so difficult for Palestinians that they will either leave or be too afraid to resist. Palestinians have fought back. For decades, they tried to achieve national liberation through armed struggle. Some groups still do, but the majority now support popular protest instead. The deeply harmful pattern of control, repression, and violence profoundly harms Palestinians living under occupation and Israelis living as occupiers. This must be broken to reach a peaceful and secure future for both peoples. Now that you understand the problem, what about the solution? What about peace talks? So far, over 2 decades of US-backed peace talks have actually made things worse by helping Israel continue the occupation. It's been years of talking while Israel massively expanded the Jewish settlements and literally redrew the map. Peace talks are good if they're real, but not when they're theater to cover a land grab. So now what? The current world superpower, the United States, has been a terrible friend, enabling Israel's destructive and self-destructive expansion onto Palestinian land by funding the Israeli military, the biggest recipient of US foreign aid in the world. But there's another superpower that can make the difference: you. There's a movement with hundreds of thousands of people just like you across the world, including Palestinians and Israelis, protesting, educating, divesting, and boycotting, all to bring nonviolent international pressure on Israel to stop violating human rights of Palestinians. Throughout history, where governments have failed to push for justice, people just like you, like us, have taken the lead and won. Now it's the Palestinians' turn for freedom and justice. We can pressure Israel to end the occupation and the discrimination. We want all people, Jews and Palestinians, to have equality, human rights, and democracy. We can change history. Join us.
Okay. Well, first we are going to be hearing from Chris. And Chris, I am going to spotlight you right now.
Hey, good morning or afternoon, everybody. And thanks for doing this webinar, Portland Mennonite. And I think the first thing I wanted to talk about is a little bit about my background and then what I saw there. I think the most important thing is I was there during my teenage years. So a lot of people who go there are adults or, you know, have a perspective of kind of having a morality or a worldview, which is already kind of set. And so they kind of come into the area if they see it or hear about it with an adult perspective, whereas I went there really 4 times during my formative years. And so what I saw there kind of is something that still is very deep within me because it sort of shaped how I view the world. Having said that, I'm from New York. Both of my parents worked for the United Nations, and I grew up in the late 60s and during the 70s. My mom's maternal grandparents had passed away, and my dads were still around living in Ramallah, which is on the occupied West Bank. And I had never really met them before. And, it was, an important thing when I was around 12 that I was sort of the oldest male in the family, that I should, meet my grandparents and adjust and things like that. Being from New York and having both parents, my father, who never really discussed his Palestinianness, and my mother, who had been a triage nurse in World War II between 1944 and 45 for the Swiss, and was neutral and was there when the camps were liberated and also during the bombings of Germany, and saw a lot of that kind of stuff, actually came to the US because she couldn't be a small-time farm girl anymore. And so a lot of what I was raised around was anti-war and the need possibly to go to Canada if there was still a draft. So in that kind of environment, I went basically to meet my grandparents there as a New Yorker, as a person who had basically, I was in the honors class in a school, public school in New York, but most of my classmates were Jewish, and we discussed Israel as kind of the, as we just saw in the Jewish Voice for Peace video, as sort of a refuge for Jews and a necessary thing because of the Holocaust and because of thousands of years of persecution, and a place that they had always traditionally had as their homeland, and that the Palestinians were the ones who were uniquely rejecting this way of sharing a home. So I went there as to visit my grandparents, but also within the context of not really knowing what I was going to find. And so I went there for the first time with my parents, and I, immediately getting off the plane, I realized there were segregated license plates, different colors for different peoples. And I was like, oh, okay, this is really interesting. Because we were visiting our family, we decided to stay at a hotel so that we wouldn't show preference to either family. And we stood in a long line getting into the hotel, and they denied us entry as soon as my father had on his passport born in Palestine. They suddenly said the hotel was full and that we were going to be denied entry. And at that point, my mom, because we were very much involved in the civil rights movement as a family, just said, this is a Hilton hotel. This is owned by an American company. Everyone else is getting in, and we were actually, the keys were on the reception desk until they saw "Born in Palestine" on our passport. And from that point on, I at that point I realized everything was not really as it had been told to me. And so I visited my grandparents. That was wonderful, but I really felt a need to come back and see for myself in subsequent, not vacationing, and just spent on my own without my parents and stuff, and just to understand my family and what was going on there. So I went an additional 3 times between 12 was the first time, between 13 and 18, and spent my summers in the West Bank, and then ultimately in Gaza as well. I think it became very clear to me that things weren't equal. I think one of the things that we saw in the video is that Jewish people or settlements had swimming pools. And I remember having to wake up at 4 o'clock each morning, and we only had enough water, or warm water, or potentially warm water, in a water heater, which maybe had 100 liters or 20 or so gallons for the whole household. And I had to wake up in the morning at 4 and light a match and, build a fire at something I had never done before. And I realized that the reason I couldn't have access to water, or our family couldn't, was because of our religion. And I realized I couldn't move or go out. And during the subsequent summer, there were military lockdowns. There were tanks coming down the street. And, just for something, when there's a tank coming down the street, you have to move towards the center of the building. If you're an apartment or even a house, because if the tank fires a projectile, it tends to ricochet off things. And so you have to move towards the center of the building to protect yourself. And so you end up playing in a very, next to the stairs or away from the perimeters of the building. And you spend your whole day as a teenager, either reading or talking, or it's an abnormal life. And then the other thing I noticed is that there would be strikes, and they would just be called, and I would be like, well, who called these strikes? How does this work? And it's the way we operate. We don't, if someone says there's a strike, you strike. You don't have to know who did it, why, and the town will shut down. So that was something that was just very influential to me, as a 13, 14-year-old. And I, it was hot there in the summer, and people, as an Arab, you're not allowed to wear shorts. You're supposed to differentiate yourself, even from the way you dress and how you look and how you think. And I was like, I grew up in a predominantly Jewish neighborhood, and most of my friends were Jewish. And now I was being asked to differentiate myself from people who I considered most of my friend pool, just because now suddenly my ethnicity, my religion, who I was, made all the difference. And I just want to relay one story in addition before moving over to my Gaza component. Is one morning I heard a gunshot coming from the street, outside of and it was close. And then immediately, about 20 seconds after that gunshot, I saw some people running past the front of the apartment building house. Each 4 stories, each family had a story. And I was like, I'm from New York. Do you run? Do you stay still? Do you move towards the, it's a human reaction, it's fear, yet at the same time you monitor. And then within about 10, 20 seconds, people started to move towards the sound. And at that point, there was someone maybe a year or two older than me, maybe 16. There was a jewelry store on the corner, and the jewelry store had been robbed. And at that point, the kid had been shot and was bleeding out and subsequently passed away. Someone my age, and he was crying, Umi, 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 which is mommy. And, and I was trying to figure out, literally as a person was dying, what was going on. And people were speaking Arabic primarily, which I don't understand. And I was trying to make sense of it. And, the person passed away, someone who, as I said, I walked by the store every day, and it was out in the street, and you could smell the blood, and it was just thing. And the thing which I think really changed for me is that apparently the robbers had been Israeli settlers. And obviously the victim was a Palestinian. And what really upset the people, more than just the fact that someone had just been murdered, was the fact that if it had been a Palestinian who had murdered a Palestinian, there could be justice. If it was a Jewish person who murdered a Jewish person, there would be justice. If there was a Palestinian who murdered a Jewish person, the army would get involved. But the fourth possibility, which is a Jewish person or an Israeli who murders a Palestinian, nothing would happen. There would be no investigation. The Palestinians could do nothing because of at that point I realized as a person of color that I was in a location where my life could be taken, and I had no value as a human being, because it mattered who was the perpetrator. And we have things similar to this in the United States with, if a white person attacks a black person, the wheels of justice traditionally have turned very differently than if a black person attacks a white person, just the response. But here I saw it in front of my own eyes. And so it changed me, because I kind of like, I mean, all my friends were people who I would have gladly didn't see that for. And so I decided I would come back, but I needed to have some separation. And my family, my uncle, George Daraj, was a teacher at the Friends School in Ramallah. And I just said, I need to do something more valuable with my time than just spending time with family and occasionally going to Jerusalem and relaxing. And he says, well, we have an opportunity for you in Gaza if you would like to teach English. And I was like, well, I don't really speak Arabic. What do I, and they said, that makes no difference whatsoever. Actually, the kids, they're just people your age, maybe a little bit younger. Go there. You'll be staying at an UNRWA. That UNRWA you will be staying with the UNRWA, which is United Nations Refugee Works Association, which runs a lot of schools there, and they'll take care of you. You don't have to worry about anything. Just go and speak English with people. And so off to Gaza I went. And so one thing I noticed about Gaza, at that point, it was much easier to travel there, but it was a lot poorer. The West Bank was kind of second worldly, people, the homes were a lot nicer. It looked like a town, but not a wealthy place. But when I got to Gaza City, which is where I was, it was just people piled on top of each other, a lot worse than they have more than they did in terms of housing at that point. But what I discovered is that, the kids' way out of their poverty was to learn English. And so I would go to the school and just start to speak English and try to correct their grammar and have fun. And I think through me, they saw a way of an American, a teenager, someone who had the same ideas that they were, same stuff they were going through, but someone who could relate to them. Usually, I noticed it was the two sets of students, ones who were like really smart, and they would come up to me and practice their English and try to improve it and all that. And then there was another group of people who avoided me, and I was like, why are different? And I was like, because they don't think their English is good enough. And I was like that. So they were like, if I interacted with these people, they would just be like, it would just show them that they weren't really good students. And so I really had to like make extra effort to do that. And one of the things we're going to be talking about is like a twinning with and what I found in Gaza, just from teaching and just talking to kids and improving their English and just having them see an American, someone who had, sort of, who was still much looked like a Palestinian, but someone who had been somewhere else, is that, I think that when we deal, these people are feeling the world has abandoned them. That even back then, this is 30, 40 years ago, there was a sense that no one cares. There's a sense that we need to, that these kids are trying to do the best they can. They're trying to learn. They're trying to open up like every other kid. They're dreaming. They're looking at possibilities in life. And they see English, or, they see the outside world as the only way to possibly improve themselves. And so, in summation, I basically would like, my guilt is that I always knew I could leave. I had a ticket out, and these people who were they looked like me, they were in my age group, my guilt was that I could leave, and I knew I would leave, and then I would go back to school, and all the people who had told me about what Zionism was, I now knew differently. I knew that it wasn't about, it was settler colonialism. When the UN just said that Zionism is a form of racism all the way back in 1975, I knew that was true, not because it was Jewish or anything like that. It's just, it was a group of people saying only we have value, and anyone who's not like us doesn't have value. And no matter how, what the education level, all the things are, ultimately, if a group says to any other group anywhere that God gave this to us, or we are this and this, and you don't have a right, that is something that a religious community, a human rights community, a secular community should look at, particularly when, as Americans, we're the ones who are financing and enabling that kind of persecution and that systematic and institutional injustice. So in close, I think that we at Portland Mennonite, or wherever, by educating ourselves, by possibly meeting or dealing with some of the people who are now in open air prison and saying, we care, we know you're there, we love you, you're a member of our human family, and we understand what's going on with you is unjust, and we're just going to we're going to keep you in our prayers, but more than that, we're going to take action to educate ourselves and try to alleviate your suffering and improve your human rights situation. Thanks.
Oh, thank you so much, Chris. And now we're going to go and hear from Ned, who is recently back from Gaza himself. Thank you, Ned.
Thank you so much. It is quite an honor to be on this webinar. And I would like to just pick up on something Chris said when he said growing up, he knew lots of Jews, had lots of Jewish friends. Growing up, I grew up in a small town in the northern tip of Appalachia, and I didn't have Palestinian friends. And when I went off to college, I went to a school where there were a lot of Palestinians and other Arabs. And for some, at the time, unknown reason, I was very drawn to those people. And one Palestinian friend of mine said to me at one point, when I was asking lots of questions, because I was raised in an ardently Zionist home. I'm named after someone that was murdered in the Holocaust. And the whole Israel story was huge in my upbringing, and very defining of who I was and how I saw the world. So this one Palestinian friend of mine in college, when I asked him a ton of questions about, tell me your experience, he said, okay, I'm glad to tell you my experience, but I'm also going to do one thing, and that is, I'm not going to tell you what you should believe. He said, that's your job, but I encourage you to do this work because I think it's very important. And as he said these words to me, I felt my heart pounding in my chest, and I knew he had said something that I needed to act on. And so I voraciously read everything I could get my hands on. I went to Palestine. I actually studied in Israel for a year at the Hebrew University. And I realized that this was a passion of mine to figure out what's my role as a Jewish person vis-a-vis the Palestine question. And how do I, with some integrity, live out the Jewish values I was raised with of justice, justice thou shalt pursue, when it comes to not the Vietnam War or the struggle for women's rights or people of color getting justice in this country, but what am I going to do when it comes to the issue of Palestine? So let me share with you something that I just put together after having returned from Gaza a couple of weeks ago. Having just returned from a Washington Physicians for Social Responsibility delegation to Gaza, I reflect upon sweetness, pain, despair, injustice, and more emotions than my heart can contain. I was honored to work with mental health practitioners, high school students, clients at a women's center, and refugee camp residents, and guide them through trauma-informed stress reduction workshops. What this diverse and amazing group of people shared offered me an unforgettable glimpse into what it's like when a beautiful people, clinging desperately to some kind of hope, do their best to try to live, raise children, and find meaning in a situation where that increasingly seems, at least in part, impossible. After a relaxation class I taught just a couple weeks ago in a refugee camp in Gaza, one of the participants, Ahmed, pretty choked up, shared, "When I think about my children, the situation they're growing up in, and what the future holds for them, I sometimes wish my wife and I hadn't had children. Not because I don't love them, but because I love them so much." And Rania said that after the sounds of recent bombings, her 4-year-old son, in a quivering voice, asked, "Would it be possible, Mommy, to go back into your belly?" Nadia, a vivacious 14-year-old, told me, "I sleep with a towel over my eyes because if the bombs start falling, I don't want to see them." In leading a girls' soccer team through a breathing exercise where the goal was to focus on each breath, because, as I told them, the last breath is gone and the next breath hasn't come, so we focus on the one we're now taking, the girls' soccer coach remarked, "That's life in Gaza. We don't want to remember the past because it's traumatizing. We have no idea what the future holds, but we have this moment, this breath, to try our best to enjoy life. Enjoying life is an act of protest, an act of love." To be in Gaza for me was an amazing privilege and an incredible heartbreak. Gaza, as you know, is one of the most densely populated places in the world. The water and sanitation systems in Gaza are broken as a result of repeated Israeli attacks and the military siege that's going on 14 years now. Raw sewage flows into the sea and spills onto land. Over 90%, 97% of groundwater is unfit to drink, and many people don't have regular access to running water. The Israeli blockade has limited access to basic medicines and medical supplies, and hospitals are regularly out of over 40% of basic stocks. In Gaza, well over 50% of the entire population is unemployed. That percentage is much higher for young people, well over 75 or 80%. Unemployment rates are expected to rise due to major lockdowns of commercial and economic activities due to the coronavirus. There are now at least 12 confirmed COVID-19 cases in Gaza. As the coronavirus spreads, Gaza has only 62 ventilators for a population of over 2 million people. The health system in Gaza is not positioned to deal with a massive outbreak of disease. Social distancing in such a crowded place is just not possible. We need to debunk the myth that Israel left Gaza when it abandoned its Gaza settlements in 2005. Israel, in fact, and according to international law, controls Gaza, and with control comes responsibility. Israel, as the occupying power, is obligated under international law to ensure the Palestinians under its control have access to appropriate medical care. This is an obligation that Israel is not meeting. And the fact that Gazans can't leave for medical treatment is a form of collective punishment. We're seeing clearly that wealthy countries like the US, Italy, and Spain can't contain the spread of COVID-19. Gaza faces the same challenges as every country fighting this pandemic. But on top of that is the horror of 13 years of a suffocating siege that has devastated every aspect of Gaza's social and economic fabric. The challenges are monumental in impoverished, crowded, under-resourced, because of the Israeli siege, Gaza as it prepares for the arrival of the coronavirus pandemic, which might well trigger a nightmare scenario. Quote, this could be a tipping point. Gaza is in very dire straits. The health system has been in a shocking state for a long time, said Jamie Goldrick, who chairs the UN's COVID-19 task force for Gaza and the West Bank. A global pandemic demands a global response, and the US in particular holds huge responsibility for the situation in Gaza, given its political and military support to Israel amounting to $3.8 billion per year. Cuts in U.S. contributions to the UN Relief and Works Administration, UNRWA, and to Palestinians in the occupied territories have also contributed to the crisis Palestinians are facing. The administration and the U.S. Congress must act now to do the following four things. Obligate funding already appropriated by Congress through the State Department's Migration and Refugee Assistance and Economic Support Fund accounts to UNRWA at the previous level of $360 million, so it's adequately resourced to address the growing crisis. 2, ensure that funding in the 2021 appropriations package is there so that UNRWA can appropriately address the threat of coronavirus alongside the day-to-day healthcare needs of Palestinians living in Gaza. 3, demand that Israel use the lump sum cash transfer of U.S. security assistance to Israel to support Gaza's response to the coronavirus. 4, call on Israel to end the closure and blockade of Gaza and allow for humanitarian aid to enter. While governments emphasize the significance of washing hands many times a day, Gazans are worried about having enough water even to drink. The fact that most Palestinians are living literally from hand to mouth suggests that the coronavirus's impact in Gaza will be exponentially harsher than in other countries. Quarantine is one of the most efficient ways to contain the spread of COVID-19, but how can the 114,000 refugees living in Gaza's Jabalia refugee camp, which covers an area of only 1/2 square mile, maintain physical distance from one another? In Beach Camp in Gaza, the density is even worse, with 86,000 refugees residing in an area of just 0.2 of 1 square mile. Within Gaza's 8 refugee camps, the systems organized to save lives, health centers and food dispensaries, will undoubtedly become lethal bottlenecks, petri dishes for the deadly virus. We all know that prisons are breeding grounds for the virus, and in the wake of the outbreak, Iran, for example, immediately released 70,000 prisoners. Other countries are following suit. The problem for Gaza, of course, is that Gaza itself is a prison. And after years of siege, it's an extremely dilapidated one at that. If there's an outbreak in Gaza, it will be a catastrophe. Nobody can imagine how the situation can be, said Omar Shaban, the director of the Gaza-based Pal Think for Strategic Studies. He went on to say, on the one hand, the health system is not in good shape. On the other hand, who's to blame for this? Is it Hamas and the PA? Is it the people? Is it the lack of outside support? Is it the siege? Is it Israel? All of these elements come together to make Gaza's situation very vulnerable, end quote. The girls' soccer coach was right. All we really have is this breath, this moment, and using it to work for justice is an act of protest and an act of love. We need to be outraged, organized, committed, determined, and compassionate. For we are all in this together, with our sisters and brothers in Gaza. Crises blow open what is possible, for better or for worse. We're in a race against time. Let's hear with our hearts and recognize our deep interconnectedness. Thank you.
Man, thank you so much, Ned. That is super powerful. Now we're going to hear from Rod, who is going to share the relationship we are seeking to develop in Gaza.
Sure. Wow. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Ned. That was powerful, potent. And thank you all for being on this webinar and for listening. But we can't listen and not respond. And so in Mennonite Church, we talk about praying for peace and acting for peace. So pray for peace. Pray for the people of Gaza. Pray for salam, for shalom, for God's holy, just peace for all the people there in Gaza, in Palestine, and in Israel. And then act for peace. And so one of the ways that we are wanting to act is by being part of what's called the Gaza Twinning Project. Some of you remember we used to have a Columbia sister church. It's a little like a sister church, except there aren't a lot of churches in Gaza. And so the Palestine-Israel Network of Mennonite Church USA is working to connect congregations in the U.S. with organizations in Gaza. So we're in the early stages. It's a tough time to try to make connections with other groups in a place like Gaza. So it's a little bit slow, but we are working toward a twinning relationship so that we can continue to learn and understand and be supportive of each other. But I want to highlight a couple of other ways that we can respond. Part of that is activism. In Britt's sermon today, she talked about using our voice to advocate for people whose voices sometimes are not heard. And so I'm going to try to share a screen here. Mennonite Central Committee in the Washington office periodically sends out an action alert. This one is a little bit dated now, a call for an end of Gaza blockade. If you want to connect to Mennonite Central Committee, you fill out a form like this, and then you can go down to the bottom and click all the areas you want to hear from them. One of them is the Middle East. I'm going to post this link in the chat function in just a moment. But it's a way, it's hard to keep track of what's going on. It's hard to know what efforts are being coordinated in Washington, especially when a place like Gaza is so rarely heard from. But this is one way for us to act in concert with other organizations. The other thing that we can do is, I gotta figure out how to get back in here, is to offer financial support. So Mennonite Central Committee has partners that it works with in Gaza itself. So by giving to Mennonite Central Committee, you can support efforts to work with people in Gaza. We can also give more directly. We have a church in Manhattan, not Manhattan, New York, but Manhattan, Kansas, who's in a sister church relationship with a group called YVS, Youth Vision Society in Gaza. They have an effort called Hand to Hand that's working directly with people in Gaza, providing hygiene kits, providing food, and providing links to resources. So if you'd like to give, you can give through Middle East Children's Alliance. When you go down to donate, I think you can designate the Hand to Hand project, but even if you can't, this money will go to Gaza and to projects there in Gaza. So I encourage you to be generous. If it's through MCC, if it's through MECA, if it's through YVS, however it is, I encourage you to be as generous as possible. So I'm going to get off now so we can hear some questions and answers, but I will post these two links, and if somehow you don't get it, email me, or we'll find a way to make this known so that we can pray for peace and so that we can act for peace in an area that often is just out of sight and out of mind. And so it's all the more important for us to be responsive. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Rod. And we are going to move into a question and answer time. We have about 15 minutes. So if any of you who are attending today, if you have a question for Rod or for Chris or for Ned, I invite you to type that into your webinar chat or raise your hand and I'll unmute you and you can do that vocally. Or I think there's a third option of doing a Q&A. So we will give you a few minutes for questions and then go from there.
Well, I have a question. I'd be just happy to hear from Ned. I mean, what's a day like in the life of a Gazan?
Well, life is very difficult. The poverty rates are through the roof. There is always fear of an Israeli attack. There is no sense of security, or how do you raise children having no idea what they might do for a living, or if there will be a way for them to make a living. the coronavirus right now is just a frightening possibility of how it might unfold. You know, as I mentioned, there were 12 cases, and people in Gaza have done a tremendous job of quarantining those 12 and anyone they've come into contact with. These were people that came in through Egypt. They've been traveling, and they brought the virus with them. But they seem, at least for the time being, to have limited the spread. But it's probably only a matter of time. The virus doesn't know boundaries or borders. And when it happens, as I mentioned, there is no way to self-isolate or to stay in your home. You're in a home with 15 other people in one room. So life is incredibly difficult. But I would also say that, you know, people are human. And there was still what I experienced, a tremendous amount of grace and love and appreciation for the fact that we were there. And, you know, as Chris and others mentioned, Chris mentioned, you know, there's a sense that the world has forgotten the people of Gaza. And so you know, the twinning idea that you have is fabulous. Just letting people know they are not forgotten is huge.
So I've seen 3 more questions come in. One is, Rod, if you could send out those links again that you showed us on the screen. But Chris, this question is for you, and it's from Allison. How is your family in Palestine doing today, and your friends in Gaza?
Well, actually, I'll have to answer that pretty quickly, because most of my family has come to the United States. You know, I think one of Israel's goals is to have as much land with as few Palestinians as possible. And for my family who is there, it's a small part, and life is difficult. You know, there's, as Ned said, the unemployment rate is really high. Particularly, I can corroborate with what he said in Gaza. People are literally living on top of each other, and, you know, 15 people to an apartment. When I was there, just a detail, it was 4 people to a bed. So I didn't have my own bed. Actually slept in a bed. It was a king size or a queen size with 3 other people, and that was just something you learn to adjust to. And so life there is very difficult. When we talked with Rod, one of the difficult things with our twinning project is that there's only electricity in Gaza for several hours a day. And so it's very hard for the people. They don't have normal lines of communication, even with the internet. You know, no stability in terms of food or safety. And so my family that's there, you know, remaining as an act of resistance. The family here is more than happy to sponsor, and everyone who lives there knows that their life would be better if they left, and that they have family who would support them in that. And so what's interesting to me is, you know, those who choose to stay are with their bodies, with their existence, saying, you know, we're going to stay here. We're going to, as Ned said, by showing love, by being positive, by being a contributing person. That's an act of resistance. That's a saying, I'm going to be a human being and love my neighbor, whatever you or however others treat me.
Wow, Chris, thank you so much. Okay, question came in from Jane Bateman. How would you approach Christians who are pro-Israel?
I'll take a stab at that. I think it's an enormous challenge, because there are certainly, among fundamentalist Christians, there is a belief that if you support Israel, you will be bringing about the return of Jesus, and therefore, you know, you need to support Israel, and so on. I think that you have to, first of all, like anytime you run into racism or prejudicial feelings, you have to hear the person out, hear where they're coming from, and try to figure out where's a hook, where's a way in. And generally, anyone that professes to be Christian, I think believes that doing the right thing is important, and living the values of Jesus is important. And I think that often is a way in, that what we just described about how people in Gaza are treated, that is not very Christian, in quotes. It's not Jewish either, that's for sure. And I think that, somehow you have to hold up this picture of what this belief in Israel means to people on the ground, and that Israel is not in many ways what we were raised. I think Chris alluded to this. It's not truly what we were raised to believe it is, many of us. And Palestinians certainly are not who we were taught they were, in terms of the association with terrorism and all this other stuff that became part and parcel of how we came to know of Palestinians in the United States. So I think it's holding up mirrors and looking for ways in to challenge deeply, deeply rooted and seated belief systems that are unfortunately prevalent in this country. But as we begin to break them down, I think that the potential is huge, because I think in the end and at the bottom line, people want to do the right thing. People that are Christian, people that go to church, they want to be good people, and they don't want to side with oppressors over oppressed. So I think that, it's a matter of dialogue and patience and understanding that we're all on this curve of growing and learning all the time, and that we once were just like that person, probably asking that question.
Well, I see we have about 8 more minutes left, and hopefully we can get to most of the questions, probably not all, but this is a question from Esther Nelson. Given its violation of international law, how does Israel get away with its treatment of Palestinians in general, and Gazans in particular?
I can give a shot at that. I think a lot of that is through information, either information that you get or information that's filtered through media. And I think, we often stress when we look at social media and the internet is we see the negative aspects of it, with hate groups and people mouthing off and doing things that, are less than we would hope. But within that framework is also groups such as Mondoweiss and Electronic Intifada, and groups that are Jewish, Palestinian, American, who generally are witnessing, I think, Christian peacemaker teams, which is a Mennonite institution. I think the most powerful thing it does is not just the accompaniment, but that there are people on the ground looking, just seeing B'Tselem as an Israeli group. And now using the internet, which is an equalizer. So I'll give you an example. My mom died when I was young, and one of the ladies he dated for a while worked for the Associated Press. And she openly talked about how, the Associated Press is one of the major news disseminators that other papers take up their stories. And she basically said that the stories come in true, they're true, but there's filters. There are people who say this story is important, this story isn't important, and this point of view needs to be amplified, and this point of view needs to be unamplified. And the way Americans traditionally got news stories was through people who amplified the Israeli point of view and de-emphasized. And I saw that myself. I mean, I would see, for example, in Ramallah, I would see the Israelis, let's say, going after the kids, and then the kids would throw tires or whatever back at them. And I would say, Dad, could you keep today's, we were in New York, just keep it when I go home. I want to see what I saw was reported. And I would see the reverse of what I saw. I would see the soldiers attacking the people, and then the people responding after that. And so it's a very different mind when you see kids are throwing stuff and then you respond versus you are gassing the kids, and then eventually the kids respond. And, I saw it. And I think we're in an age right now where we as people can find out through witnesses such as Ned going there, our own Christian peacemaker teams, through websites where people who are on the ground seeing what's going on are telling us. And quite frankly, your cell phone, you can now take a video of something that as it occurs. And so if a military occupation says this is the way it occurred, you could just say, hey, no, look, here's my cell phone. I was there. See for yourself. And I think the last thing, things that our church has done and other Christian churches as well as is come and see tours. Just come and see for yourself, and learn about what's going on and judge for yourself, as that Ned was asked to do. Don't come with, I'm not going to tell you what to think. Go there for yourself, talk to people, engage, listen to whomever you choose to listen to. Just try to keep an open mind and try to make sure you hear from a large diversity of people and make up your own mind, what you think is going on.
If I could just add to that real briefly, I think there are two things that are huge. One is there is a 2,000-year-old history of anti-Semitism that, to a large extent was promulgated by the church. And I think a lot of Christians feel tremendous guilt about that, culminating in the Holocaust, and therefore often feel, oh my gosh, my hands are tied. I can't really say this. I don't want to alienate or offend my Jewish friends. I think that's a big one. And I think we have a lot of work to do around that issue. The second one that is even bigger than that, however, I think is that Israel plays an enormous role furthering United States imperial interests in the world. And therefore, the US government and people that run the government are very hesitant to criticize Israeli actions. Those two go hand in hand. But I think that what we see is that things are changing rapidly. And we, those of us on this call and the people we interact with, we need to be part of that change. And that change is there are ways to get information outside of traditional sources, and there are ways to go there to Palestine and see it for yourself. There are ways to tell the story. There is, online just, a vast array of information opening up. So keeping the story the way the Israeli government might like it to be told becomes increasingly difficult. And I think we will see over the next decade phenomenal change in this area. If you look at young Jews, for example, in this country, older Jews, there's strong support for Israel. Among younger Jews now, more than 50% support the Palestinian struggle. That's a vast change, and we'll see more and more of that.
Well, thank you all so much. It really has been really informational. I know personally I've learned a lot over the last hour, and I appreciate, Ned, all of your work and care and personal growth over the years. You got a little glimpse of that, and wow, I'm just so amazed at the work that you're doing now. And Chris, thank you so much for your heart and your stories and telling us about the experience of your family. So if you want more information, Rod is on our Mennonite Palestine Israel network and has more information there. Chris is also a part of our working group around our Gaza Twinning Initiative, and I'm sure would be willing to talk. And I'm sure Ned would be up for an email as well. So you could reach out to any of us, I'm sure. So thank you all so much, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Ned. Thanks, Chris. Really meaningful.
Yeah, thank you.